I have a great pleasure to announce the first keynote speaker, Inderjit Singh, who actually was a member of the Parliament, but more important, a co-president of the World Entrepreneurship Forum. He's coming from Singapore, and in his 10 minutes, he's going to talk about SMEs, their importance, lack of global viable SMEs, but more important, or the most important, his approach and his idea and his execution. How can we make those SMEs more global and more important? Mr. Singh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone for coming to this session. Now, as we all know, SMEs are biggest employer of workers in every country in the world. And in fact, they form the biggest number of companies in terms of percentage of companies that they have. In Singapore, 99% of companies are SMEs. But they are contributing about 70% of the workforce, but in terms of GDP, they contribute about 30%, which means that the value add created by the SMEs is lacking and are not as big as not as good as a big company. So, you know, the issue is that why are companies not performing, SMEs not performing like the SMEs that are performing very well in countries like Germany? In fact, those are the drivers of the economy in countries like Germany, and why it's not the same in some countries. Singapore is one example. So I'll talk a bit about this. But moving forward, we realize small countries like Singapore, and I guess many other countries around the world that are developing, the next engine of growth has to be from the startups, who will then become SMEs, and then who will become the homegrown multinationals of the individual countries. So this is something that we all are looking at, and there are no easy solutions. In countries like Singapore, one problem that we face is that when you have a very dominant government involvement in business and in anything that we do, then many companies are waiting for the government, to come up with solutions. And we all realize that this worked in the past, when things are moving slower. But as we move a lot more faster with disruption coming our way, this is no longer going to be workable. That if we all wait for government to change rules and regulation, or wait for them to implement regulation before we start our initiatives, it will be too late. The finest example of what I can give is in China. They are very big in e-payment, mobile payment. In almost everything that they do today, they are already on the mobile, and every man on the street is used to it. And how did China develop these capabilities was that the government stayed at the sidelines, allowing the private sector to drive the changes in the technology, in e-payment solutions. And once the payment solution worked, the government moved in and created regulations around what worked. Now that is a fine example of how government should be regulating the changes that are coming our way. As opposed to many countries, including Singapore, where governments are putting in very strong regulations, so much so that especially startups and SMEs find it difficult to operate within regulations that have been set up and to set up solutions. So I think this is a big problem, and I would say that the way forward is really not to wait for government, but to look for the right place in the world where you can implement your capabilities. Let's talk about financing, for example, which is the biggest problem all startups, SMEs face, and most of them rely on the local banking system, the local financing system. But today, with fintech and with technology and with crowdfunding, you can derive your funds from any part of the world. So you don't really need to wait for it to develop in your individual countries, and you can look for solutions like what Kulam is going to talk about later on a bit later stage of fundraising. And we saw the ICO presentations in the morning. These are also available today. So I think this is something, my first message is that don't wait for governments to change, but you have to drive the change. And many of these has to be grounds up, grassroots initiative that can make the changes. And I think this is something that many SMEs need to come to terms with, that you have to initiate the changes and not wait for rules and regulation to change to make it work for you. And technology, as we know, is rapidly changing, and one of the biggest failures for many SMEs is the inability for them to adopt and adapt technology fast enough. And the disruptions that are coming our way are just going to accelerate the creation of new companies that are going to become the champions of the future, and the failure of many of the SMEs that exist today who are not able to change fast enough. And so innovation becomes the most important mindset thing that entrepreneurs, startups, and SMEs need to have if you want to be able to adapt in this world. And this is one area where, unfortunately, again, SMEs are a bit slow to adopt. Of course, it's not easy for small companies to invest in their own R&D and innovation projects. But, there are many universities around the world. Everywhere you go, and we have innovative universities that we hear about, and we'll hear about in the next few days. There's lots of research being done, but that is sitting on the shelves. How can SMEs look out some of this research, some of the developments that are happening in the university, and license and bring this technology out, adopt into their businesses, and to move fast to change their business model and to compete in the world. Second problem for small countries like Singapore is the addressable market. Singapore is a small market. We have a population of 5.5 million people, and 719 square kilometers. It's just a small speck, a red dot in the world map. Of course, we have been able to create some success in this small country simply because we did not focus on Singapore as an addressable market. For us, the addressable market was the region and then the rest of the world. ASEAN, for example, Association of Small Southeast Asian Nations, is a 500 million population. Then there's India, there's 1 billion, China is about 1 billion plus, and so on. So these are addressable markets. So the other thing that many SMEs fail to do is to address this big addressable market right from the beginning. In the past, SMEs started in their own shops, I would say operated as mom and pop shops, tried to develop capabilities, and then when they are successful in their own shops, they go and internationalize or regionalize to address a bigger market. This is no longer a luxury available to any of the startups and small and medium enterprises. Whenever you start a company, you have to immediately think about the global market right from day one. Otherwise, you'll be too slow to adapt. Funding, of course, is a big issue, and most of the times, many funds are waiting for the end of the valley of death to invest in you. Not in the beginning stage, but the ending stage. So those who survive are the ones who make it. And so, how to have platforms where we can find the sources of funding early enough that will allow you to cross the valley of death and to be able to grow your businesses rapidly. In Singapore, we have a big problem today after the financial crisis of 08, 09, and also for the developments of the last few years. Banks have become more conservative and they are not serving the SME market and the same way to the startup markets. So this is something that we are trying to find solutions for. And one of the ideas that we are developing, some of us in Singapore, is to develop a cooperative for the community banks. In fact, many of the developed nations, Germany, Japan, I believe in Canada, operate with community banks or cooperative banks, and those are a lot more easier to set up because those are members' bank. You put in the money into this members' bank, you borrow from a members' bank, and you regulate yourself. And so that is one idea that is coming up in Singapore, and I guess some of the countries that are here, you can think about doing it because regulations are a lot more easier. Because the big banks are very comfortable operating with what they have. We saw today the IFC presentation that it's not worth serving the small medium enterprises because it's a lot more difficult and in assessing and a lot more difficult in monitoring. So these are also things that we can try to implement from grounds up initiatives. Now, so I've talked about policies. Let me maybe just share a couple of examples of successful stories that we have had in Singapore. My first example is Razer. It's a company which grew by focusing on customer experience. Razer is a Singapore-based company which makes gaming devices. The founder, Tan Ming Liang, is a young Singaporean graduate who joined forces with Robert Croft in 2005 and produced very high-quality computer mouse, started with mouse for gamers. And their motto is for gamers, by gamers. And this certainly lived up to their expectation and to their motto with their relentless effort to provide excellent gaming experience. They actually are doing PCs and they're doing a whole range of products. Today, Razer is not only a large computer products company, but they also acquire a number of small companies to boost their company's technological experience. And this is something that SMEs and companies also should look out for, that you cannot possibly develop your technologies. You partner, you acquire, you like I mentioned earlier, go to the universities and try to license their technology. The company IPO'd in November last year, 2017, valued at US $4.4 billion, and they listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So this is another advice I have, that you don't have to list it in your own country. You go and look for a very friendly country to go and list your company. And Colum will tell you a bit about why he went to London and Germany, so there are many of these available. Another example is Chi-Square. This was a very specialized company. They started in 2006, started with video surveillance. They had, based on their experience, developed an award-winning video analytics solution. And they continue to build on their achievement. And today they have 50 men, still a SME, with customers all around Southeast Asia. Singapore is a small market. They moved into the regional market very quickly. And today they are one of the leaders in the video analytics as a service, AAS solution that help business to get real-time business intelligence report. Now, these two examples I gave you are unique to Singapore, but I think they are probably, also examples like this that you can find in individual countries. Each one of us succeed with different models, but I think there are some common things that we can look at and learn from each other if we want to succeed. And I talk about the SMEs in Germany. There are many examples that I can talk about. Talk about Zeiss, well-known German manufacturer of optical system, industrial measurement and medical devices, and they have been around since 1800s. And the key to their success has been the relentless focus on innovation, making the best product based on R&D that they do. So there are many more models that we can look at if you want to succeed. And I think this is the era for startups to become SMEs, to scale up, and then to become big companies. And today, technology is on our side. The various funding platforms are on our side. And I think the global connectivity is on our side. And I don't think so we need to worry about governments slowing down, whether or not it's Trump or any other president. I think you can progress at high speed. So I want to thank you for listening and wish all of you success in your endeavors. Thank you.